In this fragment, I want to look at a broader topic rather than a specific thinker or idea in order to set up something I want to do with this channel in the future. Specifically, I want to think a little bit about the arts and what they can offer us, particularly in a time where our existing regimes seem politically and intellectually incapable of finding a viable way forward. This is a dilemma that I looked at in the very first fragment of this channel on Heidegger. And the reason why the arts are important here is because they have a formative power. They have a capacity to shape and direct the imagination. What people imagine and how they imagine influences how people act. In other words, it can be of fundamental political importance. This is something Plato understood, and he, of course, in the Republic, famously banned the poets from his well-ordered city. But because of the power of the arts, I want to use this channel from time to time to spotlight artistic creation and encourage people to engage in it. We have the technological means to influence any number of people in this way, and it is not necessary as an artist simply to appeal to whatever the dominant regime thinks or wants. As Rousseau puts it in the first discourse, in every period there will be men fated to be governed by the opinions of their century, their country, and their society. For that very reason, a free thinker or philosopher today would have been nothing but a fanatic at the time of the League. One must not write for such readers if one wishes to live beyond one's own age. So Rousseau is reminding us that there are NPCs in every era, and generally mass appeal will go to those who could appeal most to the NPC mind, but it is possible to aim at another kind of audience. And in fact, the works which endure are probably those which do so. I want to make two claims for the importance of the arts here. First, the arts have a source, a natural source, that is outside any particular political regime. When a musician creates music, there are principles of harmony and rhythm, for example, which have nothing necessarily to do with any particular system. When a painter creates a painting, likewise, there are principles such as perspective. And in fact, this is an issue now with people who are on the anti-woke bandwagon. So a number of people have noticed that people who create movies and television programs and such have placed political considerations ahead of considerations of story and considerations of entertainment and interest. And you can do that. I mean, it's possible to create art that way with your political concerns primarily in mind, or your didactic concerns primarily in mind. But when you do so, the art does suffer. And these people have noticed that and have made some hay out of complaining about it. So what they're responding to is the fact that there are considerations in art that are ahead of considerations of whatever moral or political axe you wish to grind. I'll illustrate with a specific example from stand-up comedy. There was a show on Comedy Central back in 2002 and 2004 called Tough Crowd, created by a comedian called Colin Quinn, who noticed that the jokes comedians would try in comedy clubs and get big laughs with were often a type of joke that the leftists who ran show business didn't want to hear. And on his show, he would encourage his guests, who are comics and writers, to go for laughs and not applause, meaning in a way to stay true to their art form, which has as a goal making people laugh, not making them agree with you. Applause would usually signal agreement, laughter would signal something else. And so if someone on the show went for applause, Quinn and others would mock that person or complain or yell at the audience, telling them not to applaud, because again, their goal was laughs, not agreement. And Quinn in particular is one of those comics who is known for not engaging in the things that can make one successful in show business, and instead trying to be as funny as he can be in his own way on stage. In other words, he is what I would consider a real artist, someone whose primary concern is with the principles of his art, not with something else. Whether that something else be making an audience agree with you, advancing what people in the anti-woke crowd refer to as, quote, the message, end quote, or whether that be making the people who run show business want to cast you in their projects and make you rich. An artist can be concerned with such things, again, but an artist as such should not be primarily concerned with such things because their relation to the art form is incidental. Now, the second claim I want to make is that the arts have an enormous formative power. They have a certain power to frame or shape or to direct human souls, which is enormous and enormously important. So let's look at these 2 points, starting with the first one. Aristotle, in his Poetics, explains how the arts follow their own nature. Speaking of tragedy, he says, "Tragedy advanced by slow degrees. Each new element that showed itself was in turn developed. Having passed through many changes, it found its natural form, and there it stopped." The key element here is that tragedy, and indeed all artistic forms, have their own natural form, which means they have their own internal logic or rules or order that fulfills itself. Nature, for Aristotle, means something that has a principle of motion, and development is a kind of motion for Aristotle, within itself. So, for example, painting has its own internal logic, and when a new element appeared, such as proportion, being able to use techniques to mimic in 2 dimensions how people perceive the world in 3, that developed according to its own internal rules, which were partly based in geometry and partly based in how human perception works. Those rules are not given by human law. They're not handed down by God. They are internal to the art form, and it's this way with the other arts as well. Let's go back to Aristotle for a second. Talking about tragedy, he says this: "Once dialogue had come in, nature herself discovered the appropriate measure," meaning the appropriate verse form to be used in tragedies. "For the iambic is, of all measures, the most colloquial. We see it in the fact that conversational speech runs into iambic lines much more frequently than into any other kind of verse." So he's saying that because human beings naturally fall into iambic patterns when speaking, then this pattern became the one that was used in tragedy. Nature found a way. Again, the implication is that this development followed its own internal logic. Nature herself found the way, he said. The arts have their own nature, which is not given by a particular human regime. Now, regarding the second point, which is the formative power of the arts, let's again go back to Aristotle's Poetics for a moment. "It is, moreover, evident from what has been said that it is not the function of the poet to relate what has happened, but what may happen, what is possible according to the law of probability or necessity. The poet and the historian differ not by writing in verse or in prose. The work of Herodotus might be put into verse, and it would still be a species of history, with meter no less than without it. The true difference is that one relates what has happened, the other what may happen. Poetry, therefore, is a more philosophical and a higher thing than history, for poetry tends to express the universal, history the particular. By the universal, I mean how a person of a certain type will on occasion speak or act, according to the law of probability or necessity, and it is this universality at which poetry aims in the name she attaches to the personages. The particular is, for example, what Alcibiades did or suffered. This idea that the poet shows us what may happen, that the poet is not tied down in a sense to what is, but exists in a world of may, that this could happen or this could be possible. And furthermore, the idea that this is to the advantage of poetry as a human endeavor is very interesting. It got picked up by the Elizabethan poet Sir Philip Sidney, who wrote a wonderful work originally published under 2 different titles, one being The Defense of Poesy, the other being An Apology for Poetry. This work was written around 1580 and first published in 1595, after Sidney's death. In this work, he makes the case that poetry has the purpose of leading us, quote, to as high a perfection as our degenerate souls, made worse by their clayey lodgings, can be capable of. We see here Sidney's Calvinist upbringing, plus maybe a touch of Renaissance Platonism, in this concept of our souls being imprisoned in flesh, lodgings of clay, but his idea of poetry leading us to as high a perfection as we can get. This is the idea of poetry framing souls in some sense. Sidney is broadening out from Aristotle's claim. Aristotle began his Poetics with the idea that poetry was mimetic, that it was an imitative art. So Aristotle says at the beginning, epic poetry and tragedy, comedy also, and dithyrambic poetry, and the music of the flute and of the lyre in most of their forms, are all, in their general conception, modes of imitation. And Sidney likewise says, quote, there is no art delivered unto mankind that has not the works of nature for his principal object, without which they could not consist, and on which they so depend as they become actors and players, as it were, of what nature will have set forth. Okay? And he proceeds to enumerate many ways in which astronomers, natural scientists, logicians, physicians, and other types build on what nature shows us, that they are all imitating in a way or following in a way from nature. But the poet does something different. The poet creates something with its own internal life, its own logic, its own nature. Only the poet, disdaining to be tied to any such subjection, lifted up with the vigor of his own invention, doth grow in effect into another nature, in making things either better than nature brings forth, or quite anew, forms such as never were in nature, as the heroes, demigods, cyclops, chimeras, furies, and such like. So as he goes hand in hand with nature, not enclosed within the narrow warrant of her gifts, but freely ranging within the zodiac of his own wit. Nature never set forth the earth in so rich tapestry as diverse poets have done, neither with pleasant rivers, fruitful trees, sweet-smelling flowers, nor whatsoever else may make the too much loved earth more lovely. Her world is brazen. The poets only deliver a golden. So there's a nature that the poet creates. The artist creates something with its own nature. Insofar as this nature is, as Aristotle says, connected to probability and possibility, and is not entirely based on nothing, it has the capacity to form within us, to create within us ideas that can become realities. Again, here's Sidney. But let those things alone and go to man, for whom, as the other things are, so it seems in him her uttermost cunning is employed, and know whether she have brought forth so true a lover as Theagenes, so constant a friend as Pylades, so valiant a man as Orlando, so right a prince as Xenophon's Cyrus, so excellent a man every way as Virgil's Aeneas. Okay, so he's citing different characters from poetic works, Theagenes, Pylades, Orlando, Cyrus, and Aeneas, and saying these are high types that perhaps never really existed the way they're depicted in these poems or works of art, but they could exist. They're not outside the realm of possibility, even though nature has not created any persons so perfect yet. And he goes on to say, neither let this be jestingly conceived, because the works of the one be essential, the other in imitation or fiction. For any understanding knows the skill of each artificer stands in that idea or foreconceit of the work, and not in the work itself, and that the poet has that idea is manifest by delivering them forth in such excellency as he has imagined them, which delivering forth also is not wholly imaginative, as we are wont to say by them that build castles in the air, but so far substantially it works, not only to make a Cyrus, which had been but a particular excellency, as nature might have done, but to bestow a Cyrus upon the world to make many Cyruses, if they will learn aright why and how that maker made him. So what he's saying is, in the case of Xenophon, Xenophon showed how Cyrus was formed, not as a matter of history, but as a matter of art, such that you could make another person like this if you could put all of the things into play that Xenophon describes, which would be very hard to do, but basically Xenophon is describing what goes into making a great prince, and all the qualities that made Cyrus. It's not really him describing what Cyrus's actual education was, but him describing what an ideal education for a perfect prince would be, and doing so in such a way that other men could read it, learn about it, and try to put it into practice themselves. And that is the greatness of art for Sidney. So Xenophon's work, taken not as history or as biography, but as poetry, has a power within it to propagate itself in a way. So the next move that Sidney makes is to defend his view of the power of the arts against the argument that it might seem irreligious. Neither let it be deemed too saucy a comparison to balance the highest point of man's wit with the efficacy of nature, but rather give right honor to the heavenly maker of that maker, who, having made man to his own likeness, set him beyond and over all the works of that second nature, which in nothing he shows so much as in poetry, when, with the force of a divine breath, he brings things forth far surpassing her doings, with no small argument to the incredulous of that first accursed fall of Adam, since our erected wit makes us know what perfection is, and yet our infected will keeps us from reaching unto it. So it is in a way man's likeness to God that allows him to create things with a kind of second nature. But unfortunately, our will is infected by the fall, such that while we can imagine and know what perfection would look like, we can never really attain unto it in this world. Again, Sidney is a Protestant of the Calvinist type in his view here. But let's qualify his praise of poetry a little bit with Plato's critique, which comes in the Republic, Book 10, where he also has a pretty similar view of what poetry is and what it can do, but he also observes its problems. First, let's look at the famous conception of the artist as being at 3 removes from the truth. Socrates distinguishes 3 different makers of a couch on which one could recline, with one maker being the god who created the form or idea of the couch. This is not something visible, but it is a conception, not unlike the conception of, let's say, unity, of the number 1. This is independent of any single object or the number 1 as written or as defined, but it's something to which all those things refer and on which they depend. And basically, in Plato's conception, it's not just number, but all things are like this. There's some idea of a couch to which one refers when one makes a specific couch. And so there's the god or the maker of the couch. There is then the carpenter who makes a specific couch, which will be something visible, but also something malleable, something destructible, not something eternal, right? The idea is eternal, but specific couches are not. And then there's a third maker, and that's the maker who is a painter who paints a couch. It's not even something that you could really recline on, but just an image of one, an image of an image, which is itself an image. So that's where you get the idea of 3 removes from the truth. There's the divine image, there's the actual specific couches that can be made, and then there is a painting of a couch. And Socrates asked, well, what are we going to say about people who are deceived by imitators, who can produce things without knowledge of the truth? And in a sense, this is an important criticism, because while the arts may have their own internal logic, it's important to note that this logic is in some sense not necessarily connected to truth. And if you are pursuing truth, you can do that through the arts, but it isn't necessary except insofar as Aristotle said, the artist must produce something plausible. And if you depart too much from what people recognize as true, your work won't be plausible and it won't be successful. But notice that qualification, what people recognize. In other words, these are matters of opinion. And that's part of Plato's critique, is that the artist in some way caters to people's opinions of things, which vary, and not to truth, which does not vary. Let me give an example of how this can appear. I'll use stand-up comedy again because this is a relatively uncomplicated art form to examine. You can be successful in stand-up even with mediocre jokes if you use certain techniques of crowd appeal. One such technique is comics who come on stage and say something, oh, let's hear it for the women in the crowd. The women start to applaud. The comedian gets an applause break for nothing, and the crowd starts to believe that, oh, well, maybe this person's pretty good. People are applauding. They hear the applause, and then they start to laugh more easily at jokes that aren't necessarily as good. This is just one simple technique, and there's various ones like this that can be used. There's nothing inherent in the art of comedy to say that's wrong, that you shouldn't do that. In fact, you can still be successful if you do that. You can still be successful as a comedian if you tell jokes that are pretty simple, basic jokes, even old jokes. They don't have to be new. They just have to work. But other comedians and some audience members who are more in the know, those techniques won't work on them. They'll think that you're a hack, and you're certainly not going to be advancing the art form in any interesting way. But the point is that techniques of appealing to opinion can make you successful as an artist, while appealing to truth or appealing to something that advances the art form does not always do so. Perhaps the best example of the issue as Socrates identifies it comes from the movie The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. So in this movie, the true story of who killed Liberty Valance emerges, and the person who tells it asks the reporter Maxwell Scott if he's going to use the true story. And Scott replies, "No, sir. This is the West, sir. When the legend becomes fact, print the legend." And this is the heart of Plato's critique of the arts, which is that this is not just the way it is in the West, but throughout humanity. It is the legend and not fact which is endearing to us. And the arts live in the world of legend, the golden world of Sir Philip Sidney, not the brazen world of nature as it actually is. Now, if that critique seems a little bit much to draw from the text, let's look a little further in Republic 10, and we find Socrates saying this. And similarly, I suppose, we shall say that the poet himself, knowing nothing but how to imitate, lays on with words and phrases the colors of the several arts in such fashion that others equally ignorant, who see things only through words, will deem his words most excellent, whether he speak in rhythm, meter, and harmony, about cobbling, or generalship, or anything whatever. So mighty is the spell that these adornments naturally exercise, though when they are stripped bare of their musical coloring and taken by themselves, I think you know what sort of a showing these sayings of the poets make, for you, I believe, have observed them. Now, I can think of a specific example where people who watch Pulp Fiction and Samuel Jackson's character Jules has a quote from the Bible that he says, that before he shoots people in that movie, and people who see the movie think that they are hearing something from the Bible. But if you actually check the quote, it's not in the Bible. It's not there. It's loosely based on something that's in the Bible, but it's partly invented. But because it's in a work of art, and because it has a certain spell, those scenes that you watch have a certain spell, people think that they're hearing, he's actually quoting the Bible. But he's not. And you can make that mistake quite easily. That's the power of the arts, to make you believe that, that was true. That is an actual quotation. But it isn't. And you can find many more examples. There's many more things that you can see in a work of art and think that it's true, and then only to find out later that, no, it isn't true. But again, because what made it successful as an art was not truth. But let me suggest that Plato's Republic itself shows a way forward for the artist who wants to be an artist of the supreme type. The hint is provided by Aristotle, who refers in passing to the Socratic dialogues of Plato as a kind of poetic work in prose. He shows us the irrational part of the soul being corrected. The argument about the arts takes place in the Republic with Glaucon, who is a man with a deep love of the arts, especially Homer, but who is also kind of ashamed of his indulgence in it. And Socrates helps correct this by appealing to his manly and aristocratic side. Socrates says, "But nevertheless, let it be declared that if the mimetic and dulcet poetry can show any reason for her existence in a well-governed state, we would gladly admit her, since we ourselves are very conscious of her spell. But all the same, it would be impious to betray what we believe to be the truth." And remember that a well-governed state, as the context of this quote makes very clear, refers to a well-governed soul also. And Socrates then says to Glaucon, "Is that not so, friend? Do you not yourself feel her magic, and especially when Homer is her interpreter?" And Glaucon replies, "Greatly." But Socrates appeals to his aristocratic and manly side by arguing in this way. But we have not yet brought our chief accusation against it, poetry. Its power to corrupt, with rare exceptions, even the better sort, is surely the chief cause for alarm. How could it be otherwise if it really does that? That's Glaucon. Listen and reflect. I think you know that the very best of us, when we hear Homer or some other of the makers of tragedy imitating one of the heroes who is in grief and is delivering a long tirade in his lamentations, or chanting and beating his breast, feel pleasure and abandon ourselves and accompany the representation with sympathy and eagerness, and we praise as an excellent poet the one who most strongly affects us in this way. I do know it, of course, says Glaucon, but when in our own lives some affliction comes to us, you are also aware that we plume ourselves upon the opposite, on our ability to remain calm and endure, in the belief that this is the conduct of a man, and what we were praising in the theater, that of a woman. I do note that. Do you think then, said I, that this praise is rightfully bestowed when, contemplating a character that we would not accept, but would be ashamed of in ourselves, we do not abominate it, but take pleasure and approve? No, by Zeus, he said, it does not seem reasonable. Now, when a character in Plato swears by a god, this is kind of a big deal. It's not an idle phrase, this by Zeus. It's an indication of significant emotion or a significant revelation. Glaucon is disturbed by this observation of Socrates, that we praise something in the theater which we blame in real life. It doesn't seem reasonable to do so. And Socrates explains why it actually is reasonable using his conception of the soul that was established earlier in the Republic. Oh yes, said I, if you would consider it in this way. In what way? If you would reflect that the part of the soul that in the former case, in our own misfortunes, was forcibly restrained, and that has hungered for tears and a good cry and satisfaction, because it is its nature to desire these things, is the element in us that the poets satisfy and delight, and that the best element in our nature, since it has never been properly educated by reason or even by habit, then relaxes its guard over the plaintive part, inasmuch as this is contemplating the woes of others, and it is no shame to it to praise and pity another who, claiming to be a good man, abandons himself to excess in his grief. But it thinks this vicarious pleasure is so much clear gain, and would not consent to forfeit it by disdaining the poem altogether. That is, I think, because few are capable of reflecting that what we enjoy in others will inevitably react upon ourselves. For after feeding fat the emotion of pity there, it is not easy to restrain it in our own sufferings. I think this is why Aristotle describes the emotions roused by tragedy, the emotions of pity and fear, as he famously says, are then purged in a kind of catharsis. So Aristotle has this idea that you go to the theater and you see these tragedies and it brings these emotions up in you, but it brings them up only to purge them. I think he's thinking of this critique of Socrates that you're in a sense doing something dangerous by going to the theater because you're indulging in emotions that could get the better of you. You're feeding them. And when you feed them and you say that, well, I'm not the one feeling it. It's a character on the stage. I'm just participating in this emotion a little bit vicariously. Socrates says it does affect you. It does disorder you in a way to do this. You do lose some bit of self-control. And perhaps Aristotle is suggesting through his idea of catharsis, a way in which you aren't indulging in something, but you are calling up an emotion, but also purging yourself of it. You're doing something healthy in a way. In the same way that perhaps you could say that you eat certain things in order to purge your body of toxins. You go to the theater to purge your body, your mind of certain emotions. Perhaps that's his idea. Socrates goes on to say, "For we have come to see that we must not take such poetry seriously as a serious thing that lays hold on truth, but that he who lends an ear to it must be on his guard, fearing for the polity in his soul, and must believe what we have said about poetry. By all means," Glaucon said, "I concur. Yes, for great is the struggle," I said, "dear Glaucon, a far greater contest than we think it, that determines whether a man prove good or bad, so that not the lure of honor or wealth or any office, no, nor of poetry either, should incite us to be careless of righteousness and of all excellence." "I agree with you," he replied, "in view of what we have set forth, and I think that anyone else would do so too." What Plato shows us here is how a conception of the truth may be adapted to the character and capacity of a man. In other words, we're being shown through the Republic and through Socrates how some amount of the truth can be adapted and made fit for the character of a certain man, in this case, that man being Glaucon. Glaucon is somewhat disordered in his soul by his over love of poetry. And this is mitigated in Socrates by minding him of his aristocratic and manly temperament, which would disdain some of the things that he enjoys in the theater, and in a way tries to bring him back to himself, tries to moderate him in a way. And I would argue that this is the way it is with truth for Plato, that any person has some capacity for truth, some limited capacity. It's always limited, however expansive it may be. And the work of adapting a man to the truth is, for Plato, not only a philosophical work, but also in some ways an artistic work. That is, to go back to Sidney for a moment, Plato created a Socrates, like Xenophon created Cyrus, in order to bestow upon each man another Socrates to the extent that such a man could become like Socrates. This is what the arts can do. Now, in later videos, I want to look at some different works along these lines, and I'll also have a guide to how to understand poetry coming.